In our last activity, we were looking at the different ways that we have for our kids to do multiplication, and we looked at the time it takes for each one. And when we really looked at the time it took for the different methods, the traditional method, the partial products method, so on, they all took about the same amount of time. But we learned that the quickest method is the calculator. So we don't need to spend a whole lot of time on that calculation part because we have the calculators that can do those big computations for us when we need to. What we found is really important is understanding the concepts behind that multiplication. Why are we carrying the 1 and so forth? So to fully understand that, we need to take a look at how human beings learn. How does our brain absorb information? Because if we don't understand how the brain learns, then our instruction is not going to be effective. So we're going to take a look at some theories of learning. Now, you did read an article from Western Governors University about 5 theories of learning. If you click on some of those links within the article, you can find lots of good information, more information about each theory. We're just going to briefly go over them and highlight some of the differences and what you might see in a classroom that comes from that theory of learning. First one we'll talk about is behaviorism. You probably have heard of Pavlov and Pavlov's dogs. You may have heard of B.F. Skinner, who's very famous in behaviorism, written many things. But when we think of behaviorism, we think of classical conditioning, which is Pavlovian conditioning. And this was the classical experiment with Pavlov and his dogs, where he trained them to salivate when there was a bell rang. He paired the sound of a bell or a metronome or something with giving them food, giving them meat. And so eventually they didn't even need the meat to salivate. He could just make that sound and they knew that meat was soon to follow. So some examples that you might see of classical conditioning would be ringtones, notifications. If you hear your notification on somebody else's phone, when you hear that sound, you're kind of conditioned to pull out your phone and check it, even if it's on someone else's phone. You might start to salivate yourself when you smell something cooking in a restaurant as you walk by on the sidewalk. A frightening experience on the way to school, like I think of a little kid walking on their way to school and there's a scary dog barking, they can associate that fear they had with going to school. A good report card. A report card is just a piece of paper, but if it has an A on it and your parent takes you for a reward, it has meaning. It gets a little bit of meaning. We also talk about operant conditioning with behaviorism, and that's where we talk about the outside influences on behavior and consequences. Thorndike's law of effect says that we're likely to repeat positive experiences. So we see a lot of positive reinforcement within classrooms. We try to make experiences positive. We do have consequences for our behavior. We call them reinforcement and punishment. Reinforcement makes the behavior more likely. Punishment makes a behavior makes behavior unlikely to happen, less likely to happen. Positives and negative reinforcement have to do with the availability or unavailability of a consequence. So you might use withholding a consequence as a reward, or you might withhold a consequence as a punishment. If you don't do your homework, you're not allowed to go to the after-school activity. That would be withholding something that you want to do. Or it could be if you clean up your room, then you don't have to do the dishes. So that's withholding something you might not want to do. Some things you might see with this would be drills and tracking progress. You can see with doing drills and tracking your own progress, you can see the progress you're making. Question and answers, increasing in complexity. Guided practice with demonstration, and regular review with reinforcement. Next on our list is humanism. This is Maslow, Rogers, and Bugental. And this is where we talk about a hierarchy of needs. The optimum state of learning is self-actualization, where students have reached their full potential. And according to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, we need to make sure that all of these the things in the tiers below are met as well as they can be to maximize the self-actualization. So some things you might see around humanism in the classroom would be giving students choices. We want to foster engagement, and that inspires self-motivation and self-evaluation. We acknowledge feelings are important, as well as the knowledge that you're gaining in the classroom. And we always talk about a safe learning environment. Learners need to feel safe in order to be able to learn. The third theory of learning we're talking about today is Connectivism with Seaman and Downs. And Connectivism is one of the newer learning theories, and it is really all about connections. So it is featuring that technology that allows you to make connections with people all over the world, information that's all over the world, in that with social media. We talk about gamification, trying to make things in the classroom into different games and simulations, trying to make them as real world-like as possible. And we do that because we learn things from others. The fourth one is Constructivism. This is Dewey, Piaget, and Brunner. And Constructivism in a classroom focuses on students, their interests, and their questions. You're going to see a lot of tactile objects, a lot of manipulatives as your primary materials, concrete objects. We start with the big idea, and we learn the big idea and then break that into smaller parts. So there's a lot of student constructed knowledge with a goal of problem solving, and students learn and build on that knowledge through their active engagement in the lesson. And the fifth one is Cognitivism, which goes way back to Plato, Descartes, and Piaget in the more recent future. And Cognitivism is really learning how the brain works, how the brain stores information, what kind of things we can do with that information once we have learned it. So we have to understand how learning fits into the bigger picture. We have to use that already learned knowledge, that past knowledge, to improve what we're currently understanding. And then we have the taxonomies, where it starts with just the lower level is remembering, and then we understand, and then we can take that information and apply and analyze and create new things. And it's really the depth of knowledge. So some things you might see in a cognitivist classroom would be organized information into conceptualized models. So it's structured in a way that you're learning it so that your brain learns it the best way. It's understandable and meaningful. We build learning schemas in our brains, so retention and recall are used to build those schemas. Memory things are supported by organized learning, and we provide tools to assist in brain processing. So we have taken a brief look at the different learning theories, and I have a quote here from Maya Angelou, and it says, do the best you can until you know better. Then when you know better, you do better. I like this quote because it helps to explain why some things change and why math sometimes changes. And we have learned so much in the past few decades about how the brain learns things, how the brain learns to read, how the brain learns to do math. And as we understand that, we have to adapt instruction to make sure that our students are learning the best way we know at that time.